Jen Bernardi, the Executive Director of the Ford Hall Forum, which advances the First Amendment through the freedom of expression. Tonight we bring you Never Say Die, Immortality versus Overpopulation, where we discuss the impending likelihood of becoming post-elderly and the impact that that reality will have. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the forum's generous sponsors, including, among others, Altria, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, our excellent sponsors for next week's First Amendment reception, which is going to be fantastic with Mr. Tony Lewis, and our partners here at Suffolk University who give the forum access to innumerable services. I would also like to thank our members, without whom the forum would be nothing. Moderating tonight for the forum is Ford Hall Forum Vice President Helen Rees. Helen Rees brings to the board a rich background in publishing and public service. From 1978 to 1982, she served as the director of the Boston Office of Cultural Affairs. Since then, she has run the Helen Rees Literary Agency, the first literary agency to be established in Boston. Rees is a longtime political activist and is currently on the board of the Boston Lyric Opera. Ladies and gentlemen, Helen Rees.
Thanks, Jen. I'm always, Jen usually hands whoever's running this a bio of the speakers. Is this working? Is this working up here? And I had a long talk with both of them yesterday and couldn't stop laughing. And couldn't get them to kind of settle down and comment on what they were going to talk about. And at one point, oh, there they are.
I thought you wanted a challenge.
Yeah, I did. That was good. That was good. I forget which one of you said, quoted a very famous Bostonian, Steven Tyler of Aerosmith. It's highly appropriate given your expertise. I don't remember, John, if it was you or Michael who said, it was you, John. It was you. Said, if I agreed with you, we'd both be wrong. And I said, okay, now how on earth am I going to introduce these guys? So I got the idea, it sort of came to me intuitively that they should write their own introduction. And so they did. And so I want to read that to you. Michael wrote, Michael Fossel was born in New England and finally came back, which surprises him. He managed to get a free master's degree at Wesleyan, then drove a moving truck to California, where he got an NSF grant followed by a PhD in neurobiology after being tossed out of a psychology PhD for riding his unicycle and juggling. Since he was teaching at the medical school, they let him out of medical school in 2.5 years. While he was there, he was the babysitter for Coco, the gorilla, who spoke sign language. Although Michael speaks several languages, he was humiliated to discover the Coco sign language vocabulary was very much larger than his. He is, however, probably the only speaker we'll ever have who has bitten and been bitten by a gorilla. After tasting him, she never bit anyone again. You see where this is going. Michael met his wife in a hypnosis lab and proposed to her in bed one morning, 6 days after meeting her. They have been married 35 years, and she still apparently tolerates him, although we don't have her word for that. Michael spent 25 years practicing medicine and is still a clinical professor, although he finds that he actually knows less each year. When asked what kind of a doctor he replied, fair to middling. He has been the executive director of the American Aging Association and is the author of several books, including the only basic textbook on genetics, aging, and disease. He has appeared on Good Morning America, NPR 2020, and once had Barbara Walters speechless. He has lectured to the National Institutes of Health and around the world on human aging. Politically, he claims to be an anarchist or libertarian, depending on the time of day, and frankly, when it comes to aging, he votes against it. He wants me to inform you that when in doubt, you should always believe John Seager. So, John Seager wrote me an email after reading this. Or did you write the first one? He wrote the first one. Okay. I thought so. Okay. He says, Helen, how's this? It seems lame. Let me know. I can dust off something. John Seager is president of Population Connection, America's largest grassroots population organization with 130,000 members, supporters, and participating educators. Population Connection focuses on family planning and other positive voluntary approaches to achieve global population stabilization. John has been with the organization, formerly known as Zero Population Growth, for 15 years. Before that, he served in the U.S. EPA during the Clinton administration and was formerly chief of staff for a liberal Democratic member of Congress from Pennsylvania. This is nearly a homecoming of sorts for him. His full name is John William Packer Seager. Is that how I'm saying? Am I saying it right?
Close enough.
Okay. His grandfather, the Reverend William S. Packer, an Episcopalian minister turned editorial writer for the Boston Globe, spoke across the river to the Harvard Socialist Club for some 101 years ago. The Reverend William S. Packer remarked back then to the assembled Cambridge socialists that while he thought well enough of them as something of an anarchist, he felt in the end they were just like the capitalists in that they still wanted to run everyone's lives. John long ago gave up trying to run anyone's life. As head of Population Connection, he believes that every woman and every couple should be free to make their own, hopefully thoughtful, informed decisions about when, whether, and how many children they wish to have. So, with that sense of who's going to talk tonight, I'm going to sit down and let them take over. It seems to me, are these mics working? Mm-hmm. They're working? Okay.
Yes, they are. Oh, mine is.
It seems to me the way to start this is to let each of you talk for a few minutes about why you're here and the work that you're doing, and then you can either agree or disagree with each other. It seems to me you're at opposite ends of this whole issue. But who should we start with?
It doesn't matter. I'll go.
I think that would be
okay.
good.
I will. Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming out tonight. You know, I was walking down here earlier today. I passed the little cemetery where Governor Winthrop, among others, is buried, and I was reminded of a comment by a fellow named Dan Savage, who's pretty well known, that said, "Isn't it a shame that Australia got the convicts and we got the Puritans?" And there's something to that, actually, when it comes to population issues. You know, I'm reminded of H.L. Mencken's comment about a Calvinist being someone who wakes up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night, terrified that somebody somewhere might be having a good time. And you know, a good time is something, hopefully we all want to have. And one of the outcomes of certain good times can be children, and that can be a wonderful thing if that's the outcome you're looking for. I want to take you on a brief trip through, as Rod Serling used to say, space and time. If you left this building and turned right and went down to State Street and walked another maybe 15 minutes from here, you'd get to Christopher Columbus Waterfront Park. And then if you were so inclined, you could wade into the water and swim in a generally southeasterly direction for about 6,340 miles if you're a good swimmer. And you would come to
You need a longer lifespan to do that.
the capital city of Angola. And the way you would know you were there, according to a travel guide, is they describe the waters off the city as being remarkably fetid, since modern sewage systems haven't really reached that part of the world. The capital city has a population of 3.5 million in a city designed for 500,000. And that's both a trip through space, geographic space, but it's also a trip through time. Because here in the United States, Americans have a life expectancy of about 78 years, give or take. We're not at the top of the ladder. We're, depending on, you know, the trick with looking up anything is once you find the facts you want, stop looking because you'll find 8 other versions. Some lists put us around 50th in the world in terms of life expectancy. In terms of countries that aren't just principalities the way Monaco is, Japan is usually right at the top in terms of life expectancy. We come in kind of right about where Cuba does. We're about 50th in terms of life expectancy in the world. But Angola, according to many reports, is dead last. The life expectancy there is basically about half of ours. It's about 38, 39 years right in there. And that's also a trip not only through space, but a trip through time. Because if you were to turn back the clock and be right out here on this very street 200 years ago, you would have been in a place where, again, you know, the actuarial numbers vary. You can get different figures from different places, but some figures suggest that life expectancy in colonial America was around 38 years. Some reports have it at lower than that. The average woman in colonial America had 7 children each. Most of them died very young. If you visit any of the little cemeteries around this area, you'll see plenty of tiny gravestones, barely discernible marks, marking the grave of a child who died at 29 days or 12 months or some such thing. What's interesting about this in no small measure is that in that transition in both space and time, from this point back 200 years or from this point 6,300 miles down to Angola, it's not that our life expectancy has really changed, either over that geographic expanse or that expanse of time. Until Ronald Reagan, the longest lived US president was John Adams, our second president. The human lifespan seems to top out somewhere around 110 years. I find it tragic and shocking that, and somebody should really look into this, every few months the oldest person on earth dies. There has to be something going on. Somebody should look into this. And then there's somebody else. I think there's a mystery plot in there somewhere to be looked into. But so it isn't that as we've moved from Angola to the US or from colonial times to today, it isn't that life expectancy has changed. It's that children in our country and in a number of places around the world survive their childhoods. That's the real dramatic change. And if you had to point to a single thing, just one single thing to describe the reason, and it's not that simple, you could use this: clean water. You look at the reasons children die in such great numbers around the world. 25,000 children, and this is not a very funny fact, and I don't know any way to make it funny, but it's worth putting on the table. 25,000 children die every day from easily preventable causes around the world. Most of them from dirty water. Not directly, but they'll contract diarrhea. They're, as a doctor could say better than I, that throws their whole system off balance. They can't survive, they die. It's that and various iterations of infectious disease from other sources as well. But dirty water is right at the top of the list. Most of these children live in the poorest and most crowded places on Earth. And what's striking about all of this is that in this age of you know, all sorts of constantly emerging technology, the technologies that are needed around the world to transform the lives of people in a place like Angola and so many other places on Earth are pretty basic. Clean water, basic health care, and one other thing which relates to that. I think you could make a pretty good case that if you looked at the last 1,000 years of human technological advancement, the birth control pill, which became available in 1964, could well rank in the top 5. I don't see how you take it out of the top 10. You could maybe get a good argument with it. You know, there's been a busy 1,000 years, all things considered. But when you think about a single specific technology that had the capacity and has the capacity directly to transform the lives of half the people on the planet, so that for the first time in history, and even before history, women have the ability to control their own fertility. And when that happens, they always choose smaller families in any society on earth. And all of these things come together. The thing about the population challenge, and I'll just throw a fact or two on the table, but maybe more later, we add 82 million people a year. We're going to hit 7 billion in the next few months. Population has grown from 1 billion back in colonial times to 7 billion today. So it's this unprecedented surge of population growth that is going to go on. Really, nobody knows how long. If people tell you they do, they're telling you things they don't know. There are lots of assumptions, but nobody knows, and we can talk about those. But the striking thing about this is it's the only global challenge I know of, and I'll just end on this note, for which the following three things are all true. One, we know how to fix it. Birth control works remarkably well when used as directed. There's been a lot of research on this, some of it unsupervised, some of it maybe even going on right now in Boston, here and there, some enthusiastic participants. Number two, in the grand scheme of things, it's relatively inexpensive. It costs about $22 a year to provide a woman in a developing country with contraception. Now, $22 is a lot of money a year if, like 1 billion of us on this planet, you're living on less than $1 a day. But compared to all the other numbers we hear every day in the news, the trillions and the billions, and heaven knows what else, it's a pretty small amount of money. And third, as I said a moment ago, in every society that I know of, whenever women have the ability to control and manage their own fertility, they choose smaller families. It's a fact that when women's income goes up, family size shrinks. I'm not sure if the following is a fact, but it's an observation that you may find to be true. When men's income goes up, they buy bigger televisions. I'm not sure how they can get any bigger, but they probably will. So I would submit to you that human population growth is one of the great challenges of our age. But it's the one challenge, unlike climate change and nuclear proliferation and so many others, that we actually know how to fix right now. There are some tremendous obstacles in the way, but they don't require scientific breakthroughs. They may require breakthroughs in thinking, but not in science, although breakthroughs are welcome. If we fix this, it will make almost every other problem on Earth easier to fix. And that's really what we try to do at Population Connection, and that's kind of my opening salvo in this debate, discussion, or whatever it turns out to be. Thank you.
I want to thank John for talking about contraception, because there are other approaches to small family size, and this being Massachusetts, I couldn't help thinking of Lizzie Borden, so I approve your technique.
Or as Kennedy said, axe not. No.
John's right. A lot of us have said that there are only 2 miracle drugs in human history. One's soap, and the other in the last couple of 100 years is aspirin, the 2 most important drugs there are out there. Everything else sort of pales. Contraception, you're right, it's up there someplace, but not the things that we see that sell. I used to sometimes recommend friends they should take nutritional yeast, and they'd ask, how come I know it's good? And I said 2 reasons. One is it doesn't cost anything. 3. Second reason is nobody advertises it. Third reason is it tastes like shit. But seriously, a lot of the best things out there don't cost money, and the drugs that people advertise often are not really the answer to much. I don't mean they're not useful, but we sometimes skip the important things, unfortunately. If you look at human aging, it's been around for a while. We usually talk about 2 sort of figures, the mean lifespan you were talking about and the maximum lifespan. And John's right, the maximum lifespan, as far as we can tell, has never changed in human history. Runs around 110 to 120, depending on who's asking. But what's interesting to me is that if you look at the literature of people wanting to deal with aging, it goes all the way back. The earliest known literature that we've got on paper is the Epic of Gilgamesh, I guess. And 4,700 years ago, second to last chapter, talking about a plant that grows underwater that returns lost use to a man. I don't know what they do about women. Maybe that's for birth control. But this topic has been around a long time. And what's interesting to me is, without exception, entirely, always, any claim that we could change aging has always been no more than snake oil, period. So, as I famously said, actually 15 years ago this week, at the NIH, I started my lecture by saying, anyone who leaves this room who thinks you can reverse aging is an idiot. anyone who leaves this room thinks you can't reverse aging is an idiot. Any of you have any brains, you'll walk out and say, I don't know anymore. I'm just not sure. But it's clear that anybody who makes a claim that you can change human aging is certainly flying in the face of a lot of contrary experience, and as I say, a lot of moronic claims. So it's quite a claim to make. What we're looking at, though, is things I don't want to get into in too much detail, but the bottom line is that at the cellular level, we can effectively reverse aging. At the level of reconstituting tissues in the lab, we can do it. And I was going to say, up until recently, that there had been no trials in doing that in human beings. There has, in fact, been an informal human trial going on for the past 4 years, 1 month. And the early data is interesting, doesn't impress me. The BBC asked me a couple of months ago, would I know it worked? And I said, if I'm still alive at 150, I still will not be convinced it's not a placebo effect. I don't know, we'll see. But it's interesting work. The interesting point to me, though, is a couple of things. One is that it has the potential of extending the maximum lifespan. And probably the only quote I'll make tonight bears on that, which is, to me, the impact of extending the maximum lifespan has to do with health. And for the individual, frankly, it's a very good thing. For society, it's not so clear. And I can come up with some potential benefits, but right away I begin to think of what John's into. And from my perspective, to quote Yoda, if you're not worried, you should be. So my thought on this is that about the only thing we can do is try to figure a way to deal with it gracefully, because it's probably going to happen. Now, let me tell you a little more about it. Most of the time when I talk about extending lifespan, which is not particularly what I'm interested in, what we're really talking about is extending health. And people tend not to get that. They sort of get it emotionally, but they still start thinking about more time with Alzheimer's, and that doesn't intrigue me. And it reminds me of the old Vermont man who first sees the horseless carriage and is given a careful explanation about the engine and so on, and finishes up by saying, that's all well and good, but where do you attach the horse? We don't need a horse. What we're talking about is effectively reversing at the genetic level what causes age-related diseases. So we're talking about Alzheimer's, and we're talking about hypercholesterolemia, we're talking about atherosclerosis and strokes, and we're talking about everything that plays a role in age-related diseases. That leaves a lot of diseases we're not talking about. I mean, up in 1994, the leading cause of Egypt was still dysentery, for God's sake. This has no bearing on that. Doesn't help. Doesn't help with most of the causes of death in Angola either. But it would have a huge impact. It really would. Let me give you a little story. I had a news person come in a bunch of years ago and wanted to interview one of my older patients, and I referred him to Mrs. Johnson in room 1, who was 94. And he went in and said, tell me something, if Dr. Fossel had a pill that would reverse aging, would you take it? And she looked up and said, no, I'd let nature take its course. And a voice about like that. I'm not just being a ham about it. It's about what she said. And I said, Mrs. Johnson, tell me something. What's this big scar on your chest? And she said, that's quadruple bypass. I said, your knuckles look a little swollen. She said, yes, that's my arthritis, and that Motrin doesn't cut it anymore. I said, and tell me, why are you here today in the hospital? She said, you know darn well why I'm here. I've got pneumonia. I think I need... Oh, I see what you're driving at. Forget what I said. I take the pill. Aging sounds good when we're just talking about golden years. It doesn't sound so good when you get up every morning and it hurts. It doesn't sound so good when you cannot control your bladder, when you panic because you've forgotten your keys. I mean, we all did that at 20. We didn't panic. The major difference is not when you get older, your memory gets worse, but you do get more honest about it. But seriously, I mean, those things worry us. It's not so many things. It's the crushing things that add up day to day. And those are the things we're going to be able to deal with. Now, just to give you a piece of this, all of the standard models we have for most of those diseases are certainly incomplete, but they're pretty good models. If I look at, for example, atherosclerosis, and I ask most people in the street to name the major 4 things that cause it, they'd come up with things like smoking and high blood pressure and hypercholesterolemia, and they'd get the top 4 right away, more or less. What did I leave out? High glucose, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and smoking, yeah. What's intriguing to me is that for years I dealt with progeric kids. These are the kids at age 5, look like they're 90. And those kids die overwhelmingly of atherosclerosis. I only knew one of those kids in a number of years. We had about 40 a year in the world we knew about. None from Angola, because they don't have a good enough medical system for us to find them. Seriously. But those kids died overwhelmingly of these diseases. One kid had high glucose. None of the rest of them did. None of them had high blood pressure. None of them had hypercholesterolemia. None of them had strokes. I mean, none of them had when none of them smoked? Nothing. And yet they died of the same things. The point is that the model we usually look at for things like this is pretty good, but it's not complete. We know a little more about why that happens now and why knees begin to get out as we get older. And I think what's going to happen is that we'll cut the diseases. The inadvertent outcome of that will be extending the markedly the human lifespan. And I'm not talking about 2 or 3 years. I'm talking about a wholesale extension, not 50 more years in the nursing home. People sometimes ask how far, and the answer is I don't know. If they want an answer, I say indefinite, but I mean that in the classical sense. We don't know. It's not definite. No one knows. Could we extend the lifespan 10 healthy years, 100 healthy years? No one knows. We just have no way of telling. We've never done it. So all I want to make clear is that when we're talking about this, 2 things. One is we're not talking about just extending the lifespan. We're talking about making people have better lives, getting rid of things that bother people. I don't know about you guys. I'm not really afraid of death. Everyone here will. I will. I'm not so fond of suffering and pain and fear. And it's the same way with my patients. I'd like to get away with that, get away from it. So that's one part of it. And the other is I'm serious. If we do this, for you personally, excellent idea. For us as a culture, for us as a world society, not so good, maybe. Thanks.
Michael, I'd like to ask if you would talk a little bit about the aging process at the cellular level, because in the book you spend some time on that early on. And is it called telomeres?
Yeah, in Japanese they say taramarasu, and in Canada they sometimes say telomeres, but I kid them about calling me in the telephone to tell me that. So.
I think people would be interested in what they found out about that and how that's affecting how people treat the ailments of growing older and the process of how you take care of yourself.
Well, let me make a couple of philosophical points. One is that always gets me, people talk about is aging a disease, by the way, and they argue it's not. And these are the same people who dye their hair and use Botox. So, okay, I don't care what you call it, but you don't seem fond of it. But the same thing is true here. A lot of people will, some people will say that I talk about aging as being caused by telomeres. No. I don't know what causes aging. To me, discussing causation is usually naive. It's like trying to discuss why are you here tonight? Well, what are you asking? It's a sloppy question. Ask me how I got here. Ask me what would have prevented me from being here. That's fairly specific. But why am I here? This is just like any other kid's question about why. So telomeres, and we'll get to it, don't really cause aging. My question is much more specific. It's what's the single most effective point of intervention? Example, the average knee replacement in the US, as opposed to India, by the way, runs around 50 grand about a year ago. MI's pretty expensive. But if I could actually use a telomerase activator in your knee, we're looking at something that's 10 to the third to 10 to the fourth less money. Oh, I like that idea. Yeah, less risk, less money. That's a good idea. We're falling into the range of the cost of contraceptive and immunizations. That's a good thought. I mean, we're all worried about the cost of medical care. It'd be nice if we could have better medical care for less money. That would be novel. What we're dealing with actually is, most people somehow, Len Hayflick used to always give these models about people being like cars and like satellites. I don't know about your car, but if I put my wife's car and my car in the parking lot in the evening, in the morning I have not got a new Volvo. They're different. I mean, people are not mechanical, they're biological, and that escapes people. They still don't realize just how active things are. Example, every day, if I look at any proteins, the pool of proteins in your cells, they're not just built when they break down. Your body is continually breaking down normal proteins, rips them apart and recycles them all the time. That's why most of the time the proteins work. It's not because you fix the bad ones, to the contrary. You take apart the good ones and the bad ones and everything else, and you just keep turning them over. Very active. It never stops. Well, as you get older, that process slows down, and a lot of other processes. That's just one of them. And it turns out if I can put it simplistically, the clock setting for that has to do with the length of a little piece of DNA at the end of your chromosomes called a telomere. Not quite, but close enough. What we do know, there's a lot I haven't talked about the linkage and a million other things, but what we do know is that when we reset that telomere within certain restrictions, you can reset the pattern of gene expression and get back what look like young cells. Example, back in the year 2000, anybody wants the reference, I'll give it to them. There's some people who were using immunocompromised mice. These things don't react to anything. I could transplant my belt buckle onto these mice and nothing would happen. And what they did was they took human skin cells from young people, and they transplant them on the mouse, and you get what looks like young human skin. Very nice. It interdigitates, very nice and tight. Doesn't rub off when you push on it. Looks like young skin. If you do the same thing with tissues, with cells from an older person, what you end up getting is what looks like old skin. It's very thin and papery. They're what are called microbulli. You push on it, it sloughs off like paper. One of the challenges clinically always is trying to suture old people's skin. It's like suturing toilet paper. It doesn't work very well. And that's what it looks like. It sloughs off easily. But if you take those same cells and reset the telomere lengths and transplant them back in the mouse, you get what looks like young human skin. Huh. So that's the telomere. Boy, is that the simplified version. But yeah, the question is, can we do something about it? We know 3 methods of doing it. One method would be wholesale putting the gene in there. You've got the gene, it's turned off in almost all of your cells. Hard to do. Technically quite doable in small samples in the lab, for example. Not so easy in you and I. Although there's an experiment I've been wanting to do for years where we take some of your knee cells out, reset telomeres that way, and put them back in. Had the funding for it a couple of years ago to the tune of several billion, and it fell apart the night before we signed the financial papers. Not the best day of my life. Not the worst ever issue either. But the second way would be actually just to put the protein in we need. It's one part of the 2 proteins. Very hard. The thing's got a lifespan in your blood of about a couple of seconds, half-life. Turns over fast, doesn't get into cells well. It's a bear. The third way is the elegant way, which is to just turn it on and off like a light switch. That's actually what a lot of your cells do. There's certain early stem cells in your marrow that do exactly that with a thing called cytokines. So for a number of years, we've been looking for those, looking for telomerase activators, and there are lots of different kinds. We discovered, not meaning me, friends of mine really, discovered a whole class of these things, and the first patent came out in 2008. 2007, got granted actually. A whole class of these compounds, at least 5 or 6 of them that we know are pretty active. And there, as I say, there's been sort of an informal human study looking at this for the last few years. And what we find is that the shortest telomeres get relengthened, immune function gets reset, at least partially. A lot of early data on it, but still it's a while to go. We don't know what happens to brains and hearts and joints because for some reason people get squeamish when I go after those cells. Don't know why. Huh. So that's sort of where we are. It's interesting stuff.
Before you two go back and forth with each other, I wanted to just ask you about, you made the comment that about controlling population and the success of the birth control pill, but isn't there a school of thought about that goes way back all through history that events kind of control things in and of itself? Events like natural disasters, wars, those are the 2 big things that take place. Disease, plagues. I mean, we were just in South America and learned that, the Indians there died out within a period of 50 years when the Spanish came and infected them with measles. I mean, huge numbers of people. Is there some accuracy in that thinking, and if so, how does that affect how you're approaching that we should be looking at this overpopulated universe?
Well, historically, there's only been one recorded instance where global population actually declined, and that was at the time of the Black Death, the plague in the 13th century. But it bounced back within several generations. If you look, essentially, if you look back to sort of the dawn, when we first tried walking around on our hind legs and sort of liked it, that marked an interesting change in a number of ways. And I'm just going to mention one that somebody pointed out to me recently, and I think it's so fascinating. Most mammals are quadrupeds. They walk around on 4 legs. A quadruped can give birth unassisted. A biped can't. And as somebody pointed out to me, it is not correct. Prostitution may be the second oldest profession. The first oldest is midwifery. Somebody had to assist, and we have no fossil record of the following statement.
Not related.
But it's interesting to note that it's possible that our species had a few false starts, and it took a while before we figured out that we had to kind of work together in some way to give birth, because bipeds just can't give birth unassisted very well. But going back to my broader point, if you look at us, it took us, if you'd gone back a few 100,000 years and you saw somebody like us out on the African plain, you would have seen the mighty lions and the leopards and the eagles and the elephants. I think you would not have been impressed by us, these tiny, not, you know, it's like that line, although in this case wrong, the screen test for Fred Astaire that said, can't sing, can't act, can dance a little. They were wrong in that case, but in our case, we were not impressive. We weren't particularly fast, we weren't particularly agile, we couldn't fly, we weren't very good at burrowing. We somehow managed in some fashion to hide here and there and survive, and these opposable thumbs kind of kept us going, I guess. But it wasn't until the dawn of agriculture, maybe 10, 12,000 years ago, when we first found a way to start to scratch in the land and grow things, that our population began to increase slowly. I read recently about some fascinating research about Europeans showing they're able to track DNA, and they find that the DNA records for Europeans show that the women actually go back farther in European history, that the male DNA actually seems to come from the Fertile Crescent. That what happened was there were already hominids living, or maybe even Homo sapiens, I guess, living in Europe, but agriculture began first in other parts of the world, and what probably happened was the younger brothers got pushed out of the Fertile Crescent, and they headed up into Europe, and the women, in however the process went, could either have a mate who was going off into the forest to try to club something to eat, or to mate with a man who actually knew how to grow something. I actually heard this on NPR, and they played a wonderful song that said, "A girl likes a man with a tractor." So the point was that we grew very, very slowly as a species. In our history, the only time that humans' population actually decreased was at the time of the Black Plague. But come 200 years ago, we'd only gotten to 1 billion. The other 6 billion we added in the last 200 years, primarily because of the wonderful fact of a reduction in child mortality. Now, my mother was old enough to remember the influenza epidemic, just barely, in 1917. And there are a number of scientists who were truly terrified of what could happen. Because, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think the influenza epidemic took about 18 months to get around the world. That it took quite a while, because nobody was jetting from Asia to the United States. Today, it could traverse the globe in 18 hours. Today, it could traverse the globe in 18 hours. So could we have a pandemic that would reduce our population? We certainly could, but nobody really knows. The challenge really is that it comes back to that brain and that opposable thumbs that we have. As a species, we've been pretty remarkable at adapting to whatever conditions face us. What we've gotten sadly good at is pushing every other species out of the way when it comes to that. Whether it's directly through extinction, through hunting, or whether it's through introduction of invasive species, or whether it's through climate change. If you look at what's happening in Central America, for example, as the temperature increases in Central America, which is a hilly area, species are moving up the hill to where it's cooler. Well, guess what the species at the top of the hill do? They can't do anything. If you look at Africa, many of the cities were deliberately sited above the malaria line, where it was cold enough that malaria tended not to spread because the mosquitoes couldn't thrive there. Well, what do you think is going to happen when those temperature gradients change? So we are entering uncharted waters. It's the first time in the history of the world that any species has had the ability to literally transform our environment. And nobody knows where this is going to lead. The Malthusians could be right. The optimists could be right. I suspect it's going to be some combination of the two.
John just said that he was talking about, the advent of agriculture. And I sometimes look back over human history and ask, where were the big bumps? in agriculture was a huge change in what it did to us culturally. The industrial age, the internal combustion engine, huge changes, not as big as agriculture, but big changes. I think that when we change the human lifespan, it will be at least on the order culturally of what we did with agriculture. This will change everything the way we think about family structure, cultural structure, life, retirement, okay, everything. It changes all our standard assumptions about things. So yeah, it will be up there, and I think it will, it'll beat the malaria and it'll beat the, the cultural warming. I mean, cultural warming, that it would be, but it'll beat global warming. The impact is huge. So, but yeah, I don't know why either one of us are also cheerful about these things. I used to tell my patients that, the truth is you're going to die, you'll suffer between now and then, most people don't care, so can we move on to more important topics like a beer? Why do we sometimes take these things lightly, but we still do? You're the kind of happiest Malthusian I know.
So how do you two, it's really hard to figure out how to pull this together, let me tell you. And you two just met, right?
Oh yeah.
We asked you, Jen, who asked these guys to come here?
Was
You
it your
did.
mistake?
We blamed it on Jen.
It was mine.
But how do you, is it part, I don't even know how to frame this. How do you reconcile your thinking? You're in some ways, you're saying some of the same things, but you're going about it very differently, or are you?
Yeah, I think we look at it from different ends of it. Jump in, John. For me, it still boils down often to the individual suffering. And you're looking at it from a higher level of, oh my God, but what will that do to us? That's in some ways the balance. I like the idea of not having my patients or people I know, family members and so, suffering, pain. I could do without that. On the other hand, there's a price.
Well, I had to write a column a while back, and the hardest thing about writing columns is trying to remember the last 5 you wrote, because you can busily write something and realize it's the exact same thing you wrote 6 months ago. I'm not sure what that means, but it happens. And so I picked Malthus. I picked Malthus as my topic, and the great thing about having to do that is then you have to go off and do some reading. And one of the things I discovered in reading Thomas Malthus, who was an Anglican cleric among other things, is that he wasn't really much of a Malthusian. It's sort of it's like taking one book out of the entire works of an author and judging them by that. He made some other very interesting observations about how the enormous gap between the fact that history is written by the haves and the have-nots tend to be completely ignored in this. I think here's an interesting way to look at it, perhaps. Recently, there was a study done, as I recall, by the UN. With computers now, you can load data in, and in the past, you sort of had to work with long tables and fuss around, and now you can do tremendous numbers of iterations of a particular set of data. You can change any variable and just run it over and over and over again to see what you come up with. And what they did was they looked at human population out to 2300, which in a sense it's useful, but it can also be silly, because anytime you look out more than 50 to 70 years, you're trying to make assumptions about the fertility decisions of people whose grandparents aren't born yet. That's pretty tricky stuff. But nonetheless, they took all kinds of assumptions in terms of, I'm not sure if they went as far out as one might in terms of longevity, but they went to all kinds of different assumptions. But what was really interesting about this is in every single scenario, what you saw over that extended period is what one could term exponential extraordinary growth, unless family size was 2 or below. That's the driver. That's the driver. Even if people started to live to be 150 or 160 or 200, certainly you would see a tremendous upsurge. A couple of things I think would happen. First of all, I doubt that it would happen everywhere all at once around the world. 40% of the world today lacks access to modern sanitation, which you consider a pretty big technological breakthrough of the early 19th century. So
no, and even if what I'm talking about is $5 a shot, which could be doable, and it would certainly save money medically. You know, the average Pakistani day laborer, you're right, makes about $50 a year at best, and $5 out of $50 is a lot of money. And so, yeah.
That's exactly right. So what you would probably see is you would see that those of us who live on the wealth plateau, and there's maybe a billion and a half of us.
You are all wealthy, no matter what you feel like you are.
Yeah, let me define wealth. You have a pretty good idea where you're going to be sleeping next week. You've got a change of clothes at home. You and your entire family don't live in one room. You don't have to go out behind the trees when you go to the bathroom. You can pretty much rely on turning a tap and getting clean water at a pretty darn low price when you think about it. A few years ago, by the way, a satirical novelist tried to come up with the most ridiculous product they could think of as a satire of modern consumption, and came up with a product called Diet Water. Within 2 years, somebody was marketing it. You can actually buy Diet Water, believe it or not. It's just stunning what people will come up with.
Isn't this designer water?
It's, you know, where I live, they ran a fascinating campaign. I hope you'll forgive the digression. If you can't, well, you know, what can I say?
Do it anyway.
Somebody did a fascinating marketing campaign where I live in Pennsylvania. These billboards went up overnight for a new drinking water called Outhouse Springs. Yeah. And two of their slogans were, one is "We're not number two, we're number one," and the other was "Fresh from the can." And they were just doing it to see how people reacted to marketing. Well, guess what? For a few years, somebody actually did market that product successfully as Outhouse Springs. It's kind of mocking the whole designer water thing. You know, so back to my point, which I hope I haven't lost here. Let's just assume that this $5 pill shows up. And let's assume that over an extended period of time, it spreads out through the world and life expectancy globally goes up to 140 years, 150 years. Just to pick
and the figures, if you look at that without changing other assumptions, are what's called Fossel's rule of thumb, which is double the lifespan, double the population. Pretty simple. There are about 7 or other major variables, but we'll ignore them for now. Yeah, that's a big jump.
But what if you have, if the entire world had a total fertility rate, average family size of 2, which is the US fertility rate. Once that played all the way out, you'd have a stable population.
Mm-hmm.
It would take a while to play out, but you know, it's sort of a reverse of the whole idea that having children is hereditary. If your parents didn't have any, you probably won't either. That, you know, if all we do is reproduce ourselves, at some point that leads to stabilization. Now, the body of evidence suggests, with a very important asterisk, so far that in highly developed countries where you have all the right conditions, Western Europe being a great example, family size comes in at about 1.6. We're on the high end of developed countries for a variety of reasons. Dan Savage may have nailed one of them with the whole Puritan versus convict thing. We're the only developed country that doesn't have universal health care. We have a permanent underclass that we don't like to talk about in this country. We have a very powerful evangelical right wing in this country. There are lots of reasons for it. But assuming that, and the huge asterisk is there's an assumption that the non-Western countries will simply follow the pattern that Western countries have followed in bringing family size down. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's not the case. And we could get into that. But if, to complete my longish thought here, if in fact we did get into a world where people had 1.6 children each, as they do in places like, you know, France and Spain and Italy, give or take, then that would offset this increase in longevity. And you could actually end up in a world with declining population over a period of several centuries rather than growing population. It is possible to have the best of both worlds. It is also possible to have the worst of both worlds. It's going to depend on what we do with what we know.
Jen, should we open it up for questions now? I'll let you.
Yes. If you'd like to ask a question, you can go ahead and form a line right up here, speak right into the microphone, and don't be shy. I think these guys are holding out on us. I fully expect one or both of them to give us the location of the Fountain of Youth, and we're not leaving till we get it.
It's at Dunkin' Donuts. It's a new product.
Uh-oh.
Hi. You suggested with a little bit of black humor that Lizzie Borden had a means of population control. This being the United States, I think you could say we have a means of population control, which is called our foreign policy. We probably killed hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq, both with the illegal invasion and the sanctions. Our oldest president, Reagan, killed thousands in Central America with his terrorist campaign. We killed an estimated 3 million in Vietnam, and on you can go like that. Now, United States foreign policy, we give 0.3% in foreign aid, almost all of it in the form of military aid. And we haven't even lived up to the Millennium Goals of 0.7%, despite the fact that we're the richest country in the world.
Doesn't it make you proud to be a human being?
Makes me proud to be an American. I don't know about a human being. So what I'm asking you, sir, is that we can't just go around the world passing out birth control pills. We have to make some serious commitment to a transfer of wealth from the north to the south, and accompany it with a serious program of development and not domination, don't we?
Well, let me respond to a couple of things. First of all, I want to, and I think you'll appreciate this note. You're a bit of an optimist, because the last figures I saw is the percent of our gross domestic product. That is, if you took everything we have in this country that we produce every year, put it in a pile and monetized it, that's our GDP. We give 0.22% in foreign aid. You're actually an optimist. It was 0.3. Among the 21 or 22 donor nations in the world, we generally rank last or next to last. It's sort of us and Italy back and forth. In terms, and as you are quite correct also, or moreover rather, in terms of the fact that a lot of our foreign aid is really military aid masquerading as, if you will, as foreign aid. The point you made about the 0.7%, and I hate to kind of use so many numbers, but for years and years and years, global political leaders have agreed. George W. Bush, not my favorite fellow, even agreed in principle that we should reach that benchmark, that we should give about 75 cents out of every $100 we have toward foreign aid. We have never done it. The Swedes do it. The Norwegians do it. You know, those Scandinavians, they always get their homework in on time and keep their room tidy and all of that.
Hey, I'm Norwegian.
There's a woman named Claudia Kennedy, who was the first three-star general in the U.S. Army, first woman three-star general. And she's spoken very articulate on issues of women's empowerment. And she says, she makes an interesting observation. When trouble breaks out around the world, the president cannot he can pick up the phone and have 10,000 Marines there on Thursday. He cannot pick up the phone and have 10,000 accountants there. And it's very interesting that more and more we're using our military in these curious sort of quasi-semi sort of humanitarian missions. In fact, if you watch the recruiting ads for the military, that's what most of them stress now. You watch on TV, watch how long, so many of the ads, you would think that basically they arm these fellows with a toothbrush and a bar of soap, where in fact, the basic training trains people to kill. I mean, and I'm not necessarily objecting to that notion per se. The fact is that there is this notion, and one of our former Treasury secretaries even said it, we've spent billions and billions of dollars on foreign aid in Africa and it hasn't gone anywhere. No, we haven't. No, we haven't. We spend a minuscule amount. For example, international family planning assistance, which incidentally under this budget deal is being cut by 5%. But last year it was at $648 million. That's international family planning assistance. Now, how many missiles does that pay for? Not many. We spend pennies on things that would not only enrich the world in the most positive ways, but quite frankly, it would change our reputation in many places. There's a conservative military commentator named Ralph Peters, a retired Army colonel, who said the single smartest thing I've ever heard about foreign policy He said, when you look at the perennial trouble spots around the world, and this is off topic, but what the heck, it's almost invariably the places that just always seem to be a problem. Almost invariably, it's where the colonial powers drew the boundaries, where they did not exist before. You take 300 tribes who speak 500 languages, draw a circle around them and call it Nigeria. You draw these awkward, nonsensical lines in the sand in the Middle East, and I'm not taking sides, I'm just pointing out that the lines make no sense in terms of history or culture or anything. And we seem to keep falling into the same trap. If we got known as the people around the world who were ready to help people transform their cultures in a way that respects their culture, and there's a way to do that with family planning, and there's abundant evidence that you can do it in Islamic countries, for example, I think it would change our reputation and do us a world of good. And it's a world that we don't seem to want to live in sometimes.
This is kind of fun. It takes me back to 1969 when I was standing in front of the White House in that March on Washington. Those were the days. Were you there too? Okay. But I'll never forget, well, in 2 sentences I learned more about American politics than I ever really wanted to know. There was an older woman to take on a tear gas canister to the face down with the Justice Department, and I was trying to move some of the crowd out of the way to get the ambulance through in '69. And this one protester right in front of me, I said, "Would you please move, sir? We've got an injured patient." And he said, "I'm here to protest for peace." I thought, run that past me again? But you know, sometimes we lose sight of people when we get involved in these things. I got curious about, back 15 years ago, about what it would do if we extend the human lifespan, and it's so hard to tell with this stuff. Example, it does occur to me that mostly what we do is send young people out to fight wars, not the people who are older like us. I turned 60 last year, you and I both. We don't send ourselves out, we send out the younger people to fight wars. And maybe if we're all 180, we wouldn't be as eager to do this. But the other thing that worries me is that sense of iniquity that you were talking about. You know, if I live in Bangkok and John is rich and John can afford to extend your lifespan, and I clean his pool and I don't make much money and I can't afford this, I'm going to be royally annoyed. I mean, in these days, he and I have the same sort of rough lifespan in Bangkok. Not great, but we do okay. He outlives me a little bit, he really does, but not terribly. But if I can't afford the pill and you can, what does that do to our sense of unfairness in the world? So in short, I got wondering about what will happen to wars. Interesting question, so hard to answer.
Let me just
I
throw
do wish
something on
people
top
would
of
keep
that,
an eye on
if I
real
might.
people, though.
And let me give you, as you come up, I'll just give you the example of
Uh-oh, here comes another one.
the implications of the humble cod. You know, is there, you know, that's sort of one of the great initial symbols of the Bay State and the colony. Well, for 150 years, cod fishing off Newfoundland went along, very tough, dangerous line of work. But if you look at the catch off Newfoundland for 150 years, from the early 1800s, it kind of went like this. And then around 1970, along came these factory trawlers that just vacuumed, mostly from Europe, that vacuumed the fish out of the ocean. Guess what happened to the catch? It went way up. Within less than a generation, it literally collapsed. It didn't go down. You could have jumped off the John Hancock Tower and you wouldn't have hit the ground any faster.
I want you to know that started with my Norwegian ancestors coming over here back around 1000. It just
But it was those well, guess what? When the cod fishery collapsed, what do you think those European trawlers did? Do you think they just took them back home and beached them? No, they went into the Indian Ocean. They went off the west coast, or the east coast rather, of Africa, many of them, and many of them in contravention of international law. Well, you know what country has the longest coastline in Africa? Somalia. Do you know what the per capita income is of a person in Somalia? $600 a year. Do you know what percent of women there have access to and use modern contraception? 1%. People live, many of them, on less than $1 a day. Fishing for millennia was part of their way of life. They can't compete with those trawlers. They could send out the Somali Navy to stop them, but for 20 years they had no Navy. When they finally reconstituted it, they hired 500 sailors or recruited them, but they didn't have any boats. They literally had them walking around on shore. Now they have a couple of small boats.
And they can make more money pirating.
Well, that's what and I don't mean to make light of a serious situation, but if you were a young Somali in that country and you went into career day and there were 2 tables, one says famine victim and one says pirate, which are you going to pick? You know, there was the owner of a hijacked tanker said, you know, I have something in common with those pirates. They don't want my ship, and I don't want them to have it. We're just negotiating on how to work it out. And so imagine if instead of destroying a common resource like the cod fishery and then going to destroy another common resource, instead of focusing all our spending on war after war after war, apparently without end, amen, we were to invest more heavily in techniques and technologies that can transform a society.
Or are you
less than a
an
generation.
optimist? Human beings are a rotten lot anyway. We're all gonna.
Let's hear from this gentleman for a question.
I hate to bring it back to the subject. I guess I think of myself, although I haven't before, as a Malthusian, and I thought Thomas Malthus was completely correct. He just got his length of time wrong. He would have been right had agricultural science not beaten his expectation for food running out. It would seem to me that we have a lot more to do than figure out a way to grow more food per acre now, if indeed what's happening with fossil fuel emissions destroying global climate, or if fossil fuels are going to disappear and we're going to have to figure out how to heat our homes or cool them, maybe.
See, if we'd extended his lifespan, all this would have happened in his lifespan. So
Yeah, well, that's the point. That's precisely the point. It seems to me that no matter what we do, there are so many variables now that there needs to be some top of population, or we're going to be in, as a society, human beings, written large, in great trouble.
You know, I've often wondered, though, if Malthus was alive, or to be more specific, say to Boston, if people who were alive 200 years ago were alive now, they might be voting differently and having very different decisions about, for example, development. When they're well aware of the passenger pigeon having been, when they're aware of the changes that have occurred, we have such a narrow framework sometimes we don't realize what we're losing. I don't mean to make that a push for altering lifespan, but I've often wondered that.
Well, it's possible that both of you are right, and you have to hit it on at least John's end, maybe in a non-totalitarian way, right? China seemed to have stopped population growth in a totalitarian way. But my fear is that in your end, even if his works, we're going to have more and more people using up those fossil fuels or whatever else. And it would seem to me one of the things that we might want to think about, rather than extending lifespan, is finding a way as a society to do something close to Sarah Palin's death panels. Come close to making a decision about how long we want human beings to be able to survive on this earth.
Are you volunteering?
Yes.
No, I mean to die.
Yes.
Okay. Maybe I shouldn't say the most honest, but certainly the most, with the most pathos I've ever seen this question asked, is somebody who said to me, if you extend the human lifespan, are you interfering with God's will? I kind of like that, because it's a nice emotional question. I know, and I wasn't assuming that, but she asked the question, I didn't. And I said, all right, and I hit back below the belt. I often do this. And I said, all right, assuming that's true, I mean, I see a lot of patients. Where do we draw the line? And the week before she'd asked me this, I had a 4-year-old girl hitting her bicycle. I'm interfering with God's will saving that kid. That doesn't count. I had a 41-year-old woman with 3 kids. She's dying of terminal colon cancer. Should we try to save her? Wouldn't help anyway, by the way. But, I got a 79-year-old guy with a heart attack. When does it stop? Because I said to her, if your feeling is that there's certain people we should let alone because it's interfering with God's will, then you are welcome to your God and I'll stick with mine. That's not fair. It's the idea that somebody is past their prime because they're too old, is the wrong disease, that just irks me. I think that given my choice between living in a crowded planet with compassion and the other way around, I'd pick the crowded planet. It's not what I want to happen. But I certainly don't want to end up deciding that it's time for you to go, unless you're volunteering.
If I may respond to that, in 1980, Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in the Green Revolution. Norman Borlaug personally, and through his work, saved more lives than any other human in history. Probably 1 billion people were able to survive because of the green agricultural revolution. which has its side effects because it's very petrochemical intensive and all of that. In that acceptance speech, he said, you know, if we don't deal with population, everything I do will be erased. Everything I do. Now, trying to predict food prices over the next month, year, 2 years is like trying to predict the stock market over the same period. You can't. But what you have now is this convergence. The ethanol that it takes to fill one SUV tank once, the corn that would produce ethanol to fill one SUV tank once would feed a family of 4 for a year. Now, who has the money? The guy who owns the SUV or the starving family of 4? But I want to touch on something here, and I'd love to give more examples, but I'm only going to give one, and I can give another later. But let's just look at, I'll give you one example very briefly, Iran. Ayatollah and his folks took over around 1980. By the mid-1980s, the total fertility rate, which is just a fancy way of saying how many children each woman has, about 6.5. Believe it or not, the Islamic leadership, and I don't want to live in Islamic theocracy, but they decided this was a really bad thing for social and economic reasons. In Iran, they did 5 things starting in 1985, 6.5 children each. Built a condom factory, social marketing through ads, increased education for women. It's the only country I know of where you have to take a family planning course before you can get a marriage license. Sort of like before you get out on Route 128, you ought to know what those little black petals on the floor do. And finally, the religious leaders in Iran said that tranquility is an Islamic virtue and that small families are more tranquil, without a hint of coercion. And I've spoken with an OBGYN who practices in Iran, and she confirms this. Without a hint of coercion, in 16 years, Iran women went from having 6.5 children to 2. The transformative effect of family planning can literally change a society in less than a generation and avert those catastrophes. We are at a point where we know how to fix this. It's just a question of whether we're going to.
Let's ask another question.
I want to thank you both first for sharing all of the information you've shared tonight, and I want to present what I hope is a quasi-optimistic question, but forgive me for making a couple of assumptions that I'll run by you. First, when you've mentioned, John, I believe it is, yes, that when we see women capable of making their own fertility decisions, they choose to have smaller families. I'll assume that the positive knock-on effects on that economically, socially, relate to the number or allocation of resources per child as family size shrinks. I might be wrong about that assumption.
It's certainly a very good assumption.
And that when we see the distribution of technologies or techniques that allow women to make those decisions, whether it's the pill, condoms, social change that empowers women to do that, that change doesn't happen evenly across the world at one time. So I'm wondering what positive models do we have now from public health or from social movements that have given us maybe a possible thing to look at for how we can disseminate technology that we know is going to change the way we think about fertility or population, but that doesn't increase disparities between rich nations and poor nations? Do we have examples of technologies that have been developed and that we've either disseminated well across the world or that have disseminated at least pretty well across the world that don't increase the wealth of the wealthy nations and the poverty of the poor nations?
Let me, I want to defer to Michael on, in a moment, on the sort of examples outside of the field of family planning, because I'm kind of a one-trick pony, more or less. But let me elaborate a little bit on that. There are 3 pathways to small families through positive voluntary means in poor countries: money, books, pills. The demographic transition essentially says, as a society becomes more wealthy, family size declines. That's almost true everywhere, unless you, as in Saudi Arabia, unless you have a particular cultural milieu, such as the Wahhabist version of Islam that militates against women's rights as we would define them and against small families. But absent those rare examples, wealth means smaller families for a lot of reasons, which I think are relatively obvious. If you start to have what we think is capital, and you're no longer living in a traditional agrarian society, your children are no longer the only capital you have. At one point, they're your only social security system, they're your only capital, so you have children. The second way is books. And if I could wave a magic wand and ensure that every woman in the world had sufficient education to be able to function effectively in her society, I think that would be the best thing of all. Here's the challenge with that. Imagine that you are the Minister of Health and Education in a small African nation. You have, and there are 10 million women in need who need education and need family planning. You have within your budget enough money to educate 1 million of them or provide family planning to all 10 million. And incidentally, that ratio is correct. It costs 10 times as much to educate a woman for a year as it does to provide family planning. It's something of a Sophie's choice, but there is abundant evidence to show that regardless of education levels, and one of the best examples in the world is in Thailand, women who have almost no education do not have larger families than women who have a lot of education because they all have the same level of access to contraception. So in a world with ever more growing problems, the shortest distance between 2 points here, maybe not the ideal way to do it, is to get birth control into the hands of women and couples as quickly as possible and to address the social and cultural and economic and interpersonal barriers that get in the way. And that's sort of and we have example after example in places like Mexico, the Kerala state of India, Iran, Indonesia, many, many other places where it works if you work it. Now, as to examples, the broader medical model, I'll defer to Michael on that.
Well, I wasn't just thinking medical model. I'm thinking, the thing that's always bothered me about the theory that the rich get richer and poor get poorer is that there must be occasional exceptions to that, because otherwise, it can't just be some single linear trend. There must be things that affect it. And I can think of at least 3 things that affect it, which are relevant tonight, actually. One of them is law. We occasionally will take money from somebody and give it to somebody else. Happens all the time. Better or worse, just historically, things happen like that. Not all that effectively, but it happens. The second, curiously enough, is sex. That is, not all rich people marry poor people and vice versa, but again, not very effectively. But the third very effective mechanism of decreasing that disparity is death. You can't take it with you. You just can't. But it's relevant in a practical way in this sense. Now, this is another one of those models I put together 15 years ago, and it goes like this. Let's say that John and I are brothers. We start out exactly the same family, exactly the same resources. And John is a little more careful than I am. He invests his money wisely. I'm not. My brother Peter could tell you this. I'm just not. What comes in goes out. I don't know where it happens. If it wasn't my wife, the checkbook wouldn't balance. No idea. I'm not a long-term planner when it comes to that. What will happen is, let's say that he and I only live 50 years. He has, 10 million, and I'm lucky I can scrape together my house and pay the mortgage at the end of the week. Okay. If he lives 100 years, that compounds. So I would argue that if you extend the human lifespan, you might actually increase the inequity. You see how cheerful I get about the social effects? Okay, thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
I want to return to the Dunkin' Donuts comment because, we're talking about extending the lifespan through maybe a magic pill. But actually, we're seeing trends of decreasing lifespans because of lifestyle diseases, which are overtaking infectious disease as a leading cause of death in some countries like the United States.
Overtaken all of them so far, except some exceptions like Angola, as I say, Egypt in 1924, but essentially all of them.
So how do you see that figuring into this scenario of extended lifespans? In some ways, we're shortening our lifespans. Are you planning through some magic pill to also treat these lifestyle diseases, or are there going to be counter forces?
No, most of the lifestyle diseases you think of are how I mentioned that the longer you live, the more your ability to plan financially shows up. But the same is true of your inability to plan in terms of lifestyle changes. The friends of mine put together this book. They mostly were talking about diet and exercise and things and I'm mostly talking about the magic pill, not so magic, but the lifestyle changes have an impact on you the longer you live. And again, you don't find, other than our progeric kids, many 5-year-olds who die of heart disease. It doesn't happen very often. It has an impact when you don't exercise and you don't eat very well over time. Curiously enough, again, most of those progress through the same cascade of mechanisms that I'm talking about, telomeres, for example. So roughly speaking, and I come up with some great exceptions, roughly speaking, if we can actually reverse aging at the cellular level, you can sort of go have your cake and eat it too. You can go pig out and do even stupider things than usual. Lots of exceptions. If you're an 18-year-old kid going 90 miles an hour down the freeway drunk on Saturday night and you hit the concrete embankment, I don't care how long your telomeres are, you're dead. No relevance. If you're another 18-year-old girl and you decide to commit suicide with tricyclics, telomeres are the least of your issues. But the same is true of some other things. Smokers, for example. The destruction that occurs in the lungs is going to recur regardless. And you know, we're not so great at rebuilding lungs, even if you have what look like 18-year-old lungs. If you smoke them to death, you smoke them to death. So this is the part that bothers the puritanical part of me. It might actually mean that you can go ahead and do these terrible things and have fun and smoke and drink and so on within reason and live just as long. That just bothers me. So, sorry.
2 words, Winston Churchill.
Always good.
Smoked, drank, had during the 1940s arguably the most stressful job, one of the most stressful jobs on the planet. And sure enough, he dropped dead at what, the age of what, 91, 92?
Well, we were just talking at dinner with my brother, that's him there, about our great-grandfather, who at age 94 was dating. He said he was robbing the cradle. His wife had died of tuberculosis. He was robbing the cradle, dating this 87-year-old woman who lived by herself. And on the way home Saturday night, he was speeding in his Model T around an icy corner, trying to light a cigar. Yeah, smoking is bad for your health. It really is. She apparently grieved over the car.
Incidentally, the likelihood, before I defer to Peter here, the likelihood, good news if you live in Angola, there's a very, very low chance that you'll die of cancer. It's
Right.
not even in the top 20.
Not gonna
You're just not going to live long enough.
You should be so
You
lucky.
know, it's like that great line from Butch and Sundance. You remember when they're up on the cliff? And Sundance, you know, Redford says, hell, I can't swim. And Paul Newman says, I wouldn't worry about it. The fall's probably going to kill you. So.
Yes.
This gentleman made a comment earlier about scientific farming and how much food is related to our population growth, and that there could be a lack of food. Well, I'm an organic farmer, and I give talks, I write books, and every single place I've gone to where there's a university extension service, they all are they call it conventional, but I call it chemical. And that agriculture is one of the biggest polluters of and degraders of our economy in America, and not only in America, but especially here, the dead zone off Louisiana, the dead zone in over between north of Long Island. And I can feed a lot of that chemical stuff goes toward pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and fertilizer. And I've got an organic farm, and I use no chemicals. I use no pesticides. I use no fertilizers. I use compost and seaweed and whatever I can find. And I can't tell you how many people I can feed off of 1 acre, and I don't have a tractor. I have a friend of mine, Elliot Coleman, up in Maine, who's written a number of books. He farms 2 acres, 2.5 acres, makes about $130,000 a year gross, and also uses no fertilizer, no pesticides, no fungicides, nothing. He does what I do. You build the soil up, and you end up with the healthiest produce on a small scale that you could possibly imagine. And he was giving a talk in Tennessee a while back when I was down there, and he said, you know, I've been doing this for 20 years, and how many times has the University of Maine come down to see how I do it? None.
Hey, Peter, when you start talking about this, you remind me about 20 years ago when you and the 4 brothers got together and you gave me a birthday present for my 40th birthday. Yeah. They got me 40-pound sacks of steer manure on the grounds that I had given them so much bullshit over the years, they were going to give some back. So I want to thank you for that. A general point about that kind of thing. So much of science is faddism. It becomes religion rather than science. And I see that, as you say, with regard to, for example, farming. People often don't pay attention to the facts. That just, this is right, that's wrong, and they don't think twice. I see that in medicine all the time, too. The example I like to run into is the difference between people who believe in herbal medicine and don't. Classically, I said this to you guys over dinner, but You know, the classic herbalist believes that all herbs are effective and safe, and I know of at least 2 plants within 50 feet of my back door I can kill them with just fine, thank you, starting with a digitalis foxglove, lovely plant. And the second thing is I run into standard doctors who will tell me that no herbal medicines work while they are drinking, what again? Anyway, coffee, yes, maybe, okay. So, yeah, a lot of it is just not good thinking. People get their heels in and decide that this is right and that's wrong, and they don't think about it. Again and again I see this. Just fashion.
We have time for one more question, so I know you've been waiting, so.
Yeah, I just feel that human population and the selling of every square inch and developing of every square inch of this planet is nothing but a big Ponzi scheme. That we have a limited planet, limited size, and I think that everything has a time to live and a time to die. And how we can just have unlimited expansion of the human species, which is wiping every other species out. The National Geographic had it has like this all this year, like supposedly April was the year that the population was hitting 7 billion. When I was in high school, 55 years ago, the population was 2 billion. So in 55 years, we've added like 5 billion people. And like, it's a Ponzi scheme. So we have to like limit ourselves. We have to say that, you know, like that some things are priceless. Things shouldn't, like this whole earth, you know, is land and water, and every square inch of it seems to have a price. And, you know, like, I think that that's a fatal mistake. So if I'm the last person to speak tonight, I have a story that my wife, when she was a girl of 8 years old or so, used to go into a cemetery that was nearby her house. The gate was always open. She played in the cemetery. And one of the gravestones had this statement on it. And she never forgot it. As you are now, so once was I. And then the second part of that is, as I am now, so will you be. And that's the way it should be. I think that, you know, the fountain of youth, it's a great idea. As long as you're healthy, you know, I believe that you should, you know, as long as you can enjoy life. But have you ever been in a nursing home and seen what life is like in places where people can't do anything except just breathe?
And that's exactly what I'd like to see us get rid of. You're right, though. Yeah. I mean, we will die, and don't hold me to this, but you know, I'm not afraid of dying. It will happen. Period. No exceptions. That doesn't mean I'm eager to do it today, but it will happen. And that, in some sense, I mean, one of the things I've observed in medicine over the years is that most people actually die very well. They're very good at it. I don't mean that in a facetious sense. Right, there is, and they often die well. Peter commented about this with your wife Janet when she died 6 months back. She died well. It happened. That's part of why I'm out here to see him. People do die well often, not always, but most people do.
If they die.
Yes. And it's not the dying. It's not the dying that bothers me. I mean, as I often say to people, it's not the dying that suffer. It's the survivors that suffer. But again, it's the pain and suffering I don't want to see. It's the nursing home. There's no value in people losing themselves. You know, either in terms of other people's respect or their compassion, or in terms of their own souls. There's just no point in that.
Well, I certainly am glad I came.
Thank you.
Very great forum.
I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. This is a pretty sobering topic, and then there's Libya, but our speakers were really wonderful, and I appreciate very much your storytelling and your humor and compassion in talking about really things that we can't do a heck of a lot about, but the fact that you two are is good for us to hear. Thank you all for coming, and Jen.
All right. Thank you to our moderator and our two speakers. If you are not a member of the forum, become one. Just ask at that table out there. And if you would like to buy Dr. Michael Fossel's book, The Immortality Edge, it's being sold outside, and he would be more than happy to autograph it for you.